recording.
Diplomat's mystery illness and pulsed radiofrequency microwave radiation. So many of you have heard about the mystery illness that has afflicted a number of U.S. and Canadian diplomats and their family members from U.S. and Canada, stationed in Havana, Cuba, and then in Guangzhou, China, in which strange noises were heard, and this was accompanied and or followed by development of a range of symptoms, symptoms encompass things like tinnitus, headache, cognitive problems, etc. Next slide. So as a bit of background, electromagnetic radiation comes in a range of different so-called frequencies. Frequencies measured in the number of cycles that pass a point per second, so cycles per second or hertz. And in the upward going arrow, we see that we give names kind of arbitrarily to bands of the different frequencies, from extremely low frequency, like power line frequencies, up through intermediate radio frequency, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray. And all of this radiation, whatever the frequency, travels at the same speed, the speed of light. And for that reason, the higher the frequency, the larger the number of cycles that pass point per second, the shorter the length of those cycles must be. So higher frequency is proportional to lower wavelength. The energy of radiation is proportional to the frequency by the equation E equals h nu, where h is Planck's constant. That means that higher energies come with higher frequencies come with higher energy. And at high enough energies, this energy is sufficient to dislodge an electron from an atom or molecule. This is referred to as ionization. And so higher frequencies of radiation are referred to as ionizing radiation and lower frequencies as non-ionizing. But just because radiation is ionizing doesn't mean that that's how it causes its health effects. And in fact, much if not most of the evidence about harms from ionizing radiation, just like harms from non-ionizing, refers to oxidative stress rather than ionization. Oxidative stress is that kind of free radical injury that antioxidants help to protect against. And you'll see that radio frequency radiation is part of the non-ionizing radiation range. So our focus is going to be on radio frequency radiation, or RF, and microwave radiation, or MW. Radio frequency radiation encompasses a quite broad swath of frequencies from 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz. That is to say 3,000 cycles per second to 300 billion cycles per second. And these translate to wavelengths all the way from 100 kilometers down to 1 millimeter per single cycle of radiation. Microwave radiation is the upper frequency end of the radio frequency range. All microwaves are radio frequency, but not the converse, going from 300 megahertz to 300 gigahertz, or 300 million to 300 billion cycles per second. Next slide. So we mentioned that diplomats reported hearing strange noises, and radiation is not the same thing as sound, although sometimes I've noticed people are confused by this, perhaps because both are waves, both are measured in cycles per second or hertz, but sound travels at the speed of sound and radiation travels at the speed of light, the difference between the speed of thunder and the speed of lightning. Radiation are what are called transverse waves, where the direction of variation is perpendicular to the direction of travel, while sound waves are longitudinal waves, where the direction of variation is in the direction of travel. But in very selected settings, radiation can produce the perception of sound. The term sound can be confusing because we use it both to refer to the stimulus, the sound wave or pressure wave, but also we use the term sound to refer to the thing that you hear, the perception, whether or not it's caused by sound waves. So in selected settings, radio frequency radiation can cause the perception of sound via a phenomenon that is called the Frey effect. It's also variously called the microwave auditory effect, microwave hearing, radio frequency hearing. But this occurs in very specific settings. It requires that radiation is pulsed radiation. It occurs only for a frequency range from about 2.4 to 10,000 megahertz, or million cycles per second. The leading theory about how this occurs is the so-called thermoelastic theory, according to which these pulses of radiation set up minuscule elevations in temperature in tissue on the order of 1/1,000,000th of a degree, and these temperature elevations set up pressure waves, which are then sensed by the cochlea and thereafter processed just as if they were actual noise. Next slide. So fortunately, the characteristics of the noises produced by RF are different from the characteristics of noises produced by actual sound waves, and we can look at the characteristics of noises reported by diplomats and compare them to expectation for the two. So different diplomats reported hearing quite different noises, and this would not be expected for a common sound source, but it would be expected for a common RF source because the character of the sounds heard depends not just on pulse characteristics, but also on head dimensions, and incidentally, high-frequency hearing. The character or nature of the sounds that were reported encompass clicking and clanging and chirping and hissing and grinding. There's no reason if this were sound waves that it would be these sounds that would be heard, that it is exactly these sounds that would be expected for RF, which produces a stereotypical set of sounds encompassing exactly these. The sounds were reported to have been heard virtually exclusively at night in settings of quite low ambient noise, and there's no reason why this would be the case if it were sound waves, which can be heard day or night in presence of some level of ambient noise. But there is a reason why this would be the case for RF, which can only be heard in settings of quite low ambient noise, even when it's perceived to be not that low intensity itself. Additionally, news reports stated that these noises had quote-unquote laser-like localization in space, which was said to defy known physics. Well, this may defy the physics of sound waves, pressure waves, but it does not defy the physics of electromagnetic radiation. In fact, lasers are electromagnetic radiation. It was reported that some people moved a few feet away and the sound abruptly stopped. They moved back and the sound came back. Or in other cases, others in the immediate vicinity heard nothing. So if you're outside of the swath of radiation, the noise goes away. But for those who moved within the territory of that swath of radiation, presumably, the noise seemed to follow them as they moved, and this is not expected for sound. Indeed, we have something called the superior olivary nucleus that helps us to localize the origin of sound in space, but it is expected for RF-induced noises, which are produced inside the head and perceived typically as just behind the head, or for some people just above the head or inside the head. But this is irrespective of the position or orientation of the person relative to the source of the sound, so the sound seems to follow people as they move. And finally, 5 Cuban diplomats each independently reported that when they covered their ears or their head, there was no attenuation of the perceived intensity of the noise. This would not be expected for sound, which will attenuate with covering the ears or head, but it is expected for RF, which will not. And indeed, the intensity can be perceived to even increase if this blocks ambient noise. So each of these are expectations or predictions of RF. None are expectations or predictions for sound, and several are frankly incompatible with sound waves. Indeed, nothing else is known that fits these features of the noises that were heard, and these 6 features of perceived noises represent the first pillar of the argument about why it is that diplomats' mystery illness must have emanated from pulse radio frequency / microwave radiation. Next slide. So, are there any contrary pieces of information in relation to these noises? Well, the AP reported that noises had been recorded in Cuba and claimed that this could not occur for RF, which indeed is true. RF as produced noises are produced in the head and cannot be recorded. But if you compare the characteristics of the recorded noises to the noises that were reported during the episodes that led to health problems, we see that they share none of the key 6 characteristics about which we're concerned. These recorded noises were not tied to health effects. Different sounds were not reported by different individuals. These were not reported to have occurred only at night. By the way, others in the immediate or nearby vicinity reported also hearing the sounds, and incidentally, locals native to the area said that the sounds that were reported sounded like crickets that were native to the area. The noises were not reported to follow people as they moved and were not reported to abate when people covered their ears. All of many recordings were reported to sound similar and to sound like crickets chirping, and spectral analysis found that these matched Caribbean crickets that are abundant in the area. So of course there's nothing, RF can sound like crickets chirping, but unfortunately so can crickets chirping, and there's nothing about having previously had a freight effect produced that prevents you from hearing actual noises and recording them. So clearly this is not contrary information. Next slide. The symptoms reported represent the next pillar of evidence. These can be compared to the symptoms reported with those experiencing non-ionizing radiation toxicity, or NIRT. Those who experience non-ionizing radiation toxicity at lower levels of non-ionizing radiation we refer to as electrosensitive, and we can compare the rates of different symptoms reported in diplomats by the Swanson study to the rates of symptoms reported in those with electrosensitivity by a study by Cato and Johansson. And we see that the rates of different symptoms for all those symptoms that were elicited in common across the two studies are not just qualitatively comparable, but quantitatively very closely similar. Headache, 81%, 81%. Cognitive problems, 81%, 81%. Sleep problems, 86%, 76%. Dizziness, 62%, 54%, excuse me, getting better late. Sorry, 62%, 64%, tinnitus 57%, 63%, irritability 67, 56, and anxiety 57, 55. So there's very close quantitative as well as qualitative concordance. Indeed, there isn't any other known exposure or condition that produces these symptoms in this profile. There are many other conditions that produce these symptoms. Anything that causes oxidative stress and mitochondrial impairment can produce each of these, but not in this quantitative profile. And in particular, both sleep problems and auditory symptoms like tinnitus are especially prominent here, and there are reasons why this would be expected to be the case with radiation. Both empirically, it's already reported to be, but also it is known, as we will see, that radiation can depress melatonin, affecting sleep, and also the entry to the brain is through the skull, and at the point of the ear, there is no skull barrier. Next slide. Although we have no specific studies that elicit signs, potentially objectively measurable signs, similarly in diplomats and in those with non-ionizing radiation toxicity, we do have sources that report on the existence of objectively measurable signs in subsets of individuals in each group, and hearing loss, vision, speech, and balance problems, nosebleeds, are each reported in a subset of diplomats and a subset of those with non-ionizing radiation toxicity. Brain swelling has been reported in individuals in both groups, white matter damage on brain imaging, and brain imaging studies in each case are reported in published studies to look like traumatic brain injury or TBI. Of note, in each case, it was reported that some had past head injury, which may be a risk factor for these problems, but some also had imaging looking like TBI without known past head injury. So the signs are also a fit to radiofrequency microwave radiation. Next slide. So there's also precedent, the next pillar of the evidence, is that there's precedent for past use of microwaves on U.S. diplomats in a foreign embassy setting. Specifically, U.S. diplomats at the Moscow embassy were microwaved from 1953 to the latter 1980s or 1990s, depending on the source. There were concerns that this could be surveillance or weaponry. Russia's claim was that this was not surveillance, but jamming of our surveillance devices on the roof of our embassy. But in fact, it's worth mentioning that it was also known that there had been identified microwave-activated listening devices both in the ambassador's office and also reportedly in the ambassador's residence. Diplomats were not told at the time that they were being microwaved until then Ambassador Walter Stossel threatened to resign unless they were told. Of note, Ambassador Stossel subsequently died of leukemia, a cancer type that has been tied to radiofrequency microwave radiation, and some others, including Shoemaker, the author of the third of the citations here, also developed leukemia. Next slide. If it weren't enough that the noises heard were compatible only with us, the symptoms reported were compatible only with us, the signs are matched, and there's past precedent for use. It's now been released publicly that there was known measurement of high levels of radiofrequency radiation in the setting of diplomats at the time that they were reporting these strange noises and health problems. Specifically, a Guangzhou diplomat gave a U.S. Department of Labor workers' compensation application that is unclassified, in which he mentioned the use of commercial off-the-shelf or COTS Trifield 100XE meter, which led to readings that were photographed and brought into the State Department that were in excess of the top available reading on the meter, in excess of 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared, or also known as 10 watts per meter squared, and these exceed safety limits worldwide. In fact, they're 100 times the safety limit in China. Next slide. So what might have been the source of this radiation? Well, the leading hypotheses would be surveillance or weaponry, as so-called TTW, or through-the-wall surveillance, is widely reported on. You can read about it in National Institute of Justice and ACLU reports, including in the United States by law enforcement entities. And this can detect movements as fine as the movements of breathing, and also can be used for auditory surveillance by quote-unquote wide-ear type technology. Another perhaps slightly more likely possibility is use of weaponry. Electronic weapons have been in development for decades. The civilian sector experiences these problems, subsets of them do, with innocent intended communication devices, but use of these in the diplomat setting for a range of reasons is unlikely to have been responsible. Next slide. So this is simply an illustration from Brenderman 1999 of what was already at that time a former Soviet Union microwave weapon system, in this case for anti-aircraft purposes, just illustrating that these have been in development, even attaining open literature representations for decades. Next slide. So what might be the mechanism for these problems? Well, the best evidence relates to oxidative stress, again, that type of free radical injury that antioxidants help to protect against, and evidence that radio frequency radiation, and for that matter radiation across the electromagnetic spectrum, produces oxidative stress, is abundant, heavily replicated, and powerfully triangulated. Replication refers to the setting in which a similar exposure is experienced or applied and a similar outcome evaluated with producing similar results. And triangulation refers to the setting in which the same problem is addressed from different angles, producing converging evidence. So Yakimenko gives an excellent illustration of replication. Yakimenko identified 100 studies, each of which asked the question of whether low-intensity radiofrequency radiation caused oxidative stress, and 93 of 100 studies found that it did. So let that sink in. 93 of 100 studies that evaluated whether low-intensity radiofrequency radiation caused oxidative stress found that it did. So this is a powerfully replicated body of evidence. And the remainder of these citations relate to triangulation. DeLuca et al. Asked whether individuals who have non-ionizing radiation sensitivity, aka electrosensitivity, those who experience health problems at lower levels of radiation than cause problems in others, were more likely to have gene variants that confer impaired defense against oxidative stress. And he found that they were indeed significantly more likely to do so, with an odds ratio of around 10. Belpom et al. Evaluated over 600 people in France with electrosensitivity and evaluated a range of biomarkers, many of which he did not note, but I would note are downstream mechanisms of oxidative stress, and minority subsets had elevations in each of these downstream markers of oxidative stress. But the one thing that was in common across those with electrosensitivity were depressed levels of a critical antioxidant called melatonin. We think of melatonin as for sleep, but in fact, melatonin also has vital antioxidant protections, and in a minute we'll see some of the evidence related to that. Indeed, additional triangulating evidence comes from the fact that a range of different antioxidants have been shown to protect against radiation injury, in fact, across the electromagnetic spectrum for ionizing or non-ionizing radiation, and for non-ionizing radiation, whether it exceeds the thermal limit or not. That is to say, whether it's sufficient to cause a level of heating that would be expected to be responsible for the health effects. Next slide. So radiofrequency radiation has been shown to be, injury has been shown to be protected against by melatonin, as shown by some of the citations here, and radiofrequency radiation, as well as other non-ionizing radiation, has been shown to be capable of variably depressing levels of melatonin. And in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about why this is variable. Next slide. So what are some of these downstream mechanisms of oxidative stress that we referred to? So just as radiofrequency radiation causes oxidative stress, and this can vary based on genetic factors conferring defense against oxidative stress, so it's the case that there are then variations going from oxidative stress to these downstream mechanisms. So the literature is a bit more variable on these downstream mechanisms. Nonetheless, there's replication that radiofrequency radiation can cause the downstream mechanisms as shown here. And these include alterations in mitochondrial function, alterations in voltage-gated ion channels, including but not limited to calcium channels, increases in inflammation, and increases in autoantibodies. So oxidative stress modifies substances in a fashion that makes them more vulnerable to autoimmune attack, and in fact, increases in antibodies to O-myelin have been shown in about 21% of those with electrosensitivity in the Bell Palm study. And these mechanisms, by the way, can then in turn also cause oxidative stress. Oxidative stress also impairs or alters membrane structure and function, causes endothelial dysfunction, impairing blood flow, which has also been shown, impaired blood flow in areas of the brain have been shown electrosensitive people, increases apoptosis or programmed cell death, which in turn, by the way, causes inflammation, and alters blood-brain barrier function, enhancing blood-brain barrier permeability to toxic substances. And each of these can then in turn contribute to health effects. Now, it was mentioned that radiofrequency radiation caused oxidative stress relatively reproducibly in the Bell Palm study, in the Yakimenko study, but I should mention that in fact there are bidirectional effects on antioxidant levels, and sometimes these can in fact lead to bidirectional effects on oxidative stress itself. But the data on antioxidant levels are highly bidirectional, and this is because of a well-known phenomenon called oxidative preconditioning that occurs with all different oxidative stressors, in which low levels of an oxidative stressor can lead to endogenous upregulation of antioxidant defenses, adaptive upregulation, in those individuals who have the ability to further upregulate their antioxidant defenses. And so individuals whose antioxidant defenses are already overwhelmed, which often means people with pre-existing mitochondrial injury who are producing excess free radicals on an ongoing basis and may not have further ability to upregulate antioxidants, in those individuals, adding more oxidative stress simply consumes antioxidants and depresses levels, whereas in other individuals, they may be elevated. So this literature may look inconsistent, but it's a known consistent inconsistency that we see also with other exposures that operate on the antioxidant spectrum. Next slide. So this is an illustration that radiofrequency radiation can cause a mitochondrial injury, and this is from Zalubovskaya in the 1970s, declassified by the CIA in 2012, looking in this case at millimeter radio waves, the type that will be used at the upper end of 5G radiation, and this is actually outside the range that can cause the effect. So these smaller wavelengths they could have been used, but they cannot have been responsible for the noises. So they could not have been used in isolation in the diplomats, but these are an excellent illustration of mitochondrial injury because they show that this occurs even with these very small wavelengths that many people have claimed could at most affect the skin and nerves because of the small wavelengths. This study exposed Wistar rats for just 15 minutes a day for 60 days and found that this millimeter wave radiation didn't just affect the skin and incidentally nerves and blood, but also affected the bone marrow, increased blood vessel permeability, and caused mitochondrial problems in organs throughout the body. In the brain and heart, which are heavily mitochondrially dependent, they're heavily energy-dependent organs, as well as liver, kidney, and spleen. Of note, rats varied widely in the degree of effect, just as we see in humans, and it was also noted that increased duration of exposure appeared to be tied to increase in problems. Just as has been reported in humans, for example, in a study by Sachikova and Glotova, who followed groups of 100 and of 150 people with microwave injury from occupational exposure, it was found that for those whose symptoms were at least moderate in severity, returning them to the setting in which they were re-exposed led to a course that was progressive. Next slide. So Sachikova and Glotova were translated into English by Gordon in 1974, which is sort of one in the middle of these, but most of these illustrations that the idea that radiofrequency radiation can confer health effects and toxicity is not new come from US government reports, showing that these date back for many decades, including a 1930s Navy report. And this, by the way, this list is far from complete. This is just a small subsample of such reports. In 1971, Glaser issued the first of his Navy reports with updates several times that decade, including the one that I have is the 1972 version with over 2,400 citations, each showing that radiofrequency radiation causes health and biological effects, with whole chapters devoted to each of a number of the symptoms that diplomats report. 1976 Defense Intelligence Agency report, 81 NASA report, and the 1988 Air Force report with the title Radio Frequency / Microwave Radiation Biological Effects, ... in which a quote is, experimental evidence has shown that exposure to low intensity radiation can have a profound effect on biological processes. Again, this in a report on radio frequency / microwave radiation, the US government itself saying experimental evidence has shown that exposure to low intensity radiation can have a profound effect on biological processes. Next slide. So we can compare the alternative hypotheses that have been tendered to account for diplomats' mystery health problems and see how they fit the available evidence with psychogenic hypothesis, mass hysteria, et cetera, more or less in the middle here. Other hypotheses that have been put forth are sonic or ultrasound, infrasound, stress, chemicals, and specifically pesticides, and viral hypothesis. We can compare how each of the hypotheses fits with specific features of the noises reported, the specific quantitative as well as qualitative profile of symptoms, the signs, precedent, and also is there a biological mechanism that is known that could produce both the noises and the symptoms. And these are all a yes for radiofrequency microwave illness, but not a single one of these is a yes for any of the other hypotheses. Certainly sonic hypotheses can produce noises, but not with the 6 specific characteristics that were reported for diplomats. Certainly pesticides can produce compatible symptoms and compatible signs, but they don't produce those symptoms in that quantitative distribution, and they don't produce the noises heard. So in fact, this is the only hypothesis that fits any of these, much less all of these, when specific features of these are considered. And this essentially compels the conclusion that pulse radiofrequency / microwave radiation is the cause.